Hey, early joiners. How's it going? Can you see my holding place screen here?
Yeah.
Oh, Casey, you're breaking up a little bit, which is Welcome, Mikhail. Thanks for having your video on. It's good to see you.
Hey, JR. Yeah, good to see you too.
Is that Seattle in the background? Which city is that?
It's Toronto.
Toronto. Okay.
It's not quite the Space Needle. It's the CN Tower behind me.
Yeah, I'm typical American. I assumed it was a U.S. city.
Space Needle is a little more squished towards the top, and CN Tower is quite a bit taller, actually. I've been to both, and on top
That's
of it, there's a
beautiful.
nice rotating restaurant on the top there.
It seems to be the table stakes for the big tall towers. Got to have this slowly rotating restaurant.
Yeah, true.
Just for the folks who've already jumped on, out of curiosity, did you all receive a copy of the white paper that went out a couple days ago via email? So I've got some nods and some head shakes. We did post it into the Slack channel this morning again as well, but you should have received, I think it went out to almost everybody on the list, an email with the PDF download link. So bring that up, just say if it's something you can get a chance to even just skim through before we start, it'd be great to get specific questions and insights for the panelists when we do kick off.
Right. I think there was a draft copy distributed last week, so I got that. I don't think I got the final link, but I read through the draft one, even though I wasn't the one who contributed to it. But I figured, hey, better level set a little bit.
Yeah. There was a vote by the TAC to approve the final draft. I think it was just on Monday, and so we sent out the final is in the first iterative final draft to. I think it was on Tuesday morning. Hi, Sebastian, welcome. And for those of you who don't have the chat open, that's a good place to keep open. If you don't want to jump in with questions, we'll be watching that chat really closely through the call. Going to get a few more minutes before we kick off as people start to trickle in. Good thing to definitely check out if you already have access to the FinOps Foundation Slack. Joining that channel there, the FinOps for Kubernetes channel, is the room for both the special interest group that does Kubernetes and where future updates to this white paper will be discussed. So definitely recommend joining that. And if you're not in the Slack, you can join via that finops.org link at the bottom. Great. Well, I think I am going to start with the housekeeping because we are right on time. It looks like we're starting to get a critical mass here. Welcome, everybody. I'll reiterate on this slide again, for those who are just joining, if you can join that Slack room, good place to have conversations ongoing. But I will say, well, you can do it either way. On this call, we're going to monitor the chat in the Zoom. If you want to post questions there, comments, that's great. Thanks, Alex Paulo, for posting. we'll both monitor those and ask them, or you can post them in that Slack room as well. We do find this meetings do best when they're conversational, chat conversational, vocally on video, etc. So please get involved. We'll have a bit of intro at the beginning, bit of overview around the panelists, and then a lot of discussion going forward from there. Can everybody see my green screen that says FinOps Foundation? Excellent. Well, welcome. I am J.R. Stormont. I'm the Executive Director of the FinOps Foundation program, which is a part of the Linux Foundation. So I'm actually now, since our last call, an employee of the Linux Foundation, which is an interesting experience. Never worked for a nonprofit before officially. Also a big day for this panel. I actually did the pre-COVID thing. I got, showered and put a collared shirt on, and as if I was going into an office, I felt like it was the right day to do it. Reminded me how long all that stuff used to take. So excited. Hope you guys have had the same good morning so far. The code of conduct that we always have to cover. There's the legal bit and the sort of what we want you to do bit. The what we want you to do bit is, contribute to the conversation, either via chat or in the discussion at the end. Definitely be respectful of other people and their comments and their ideas, whether they be individuals or vendors or anything else. And we very critically to everyone say no sales pitches. This forum is always about best practices and sharing stories. There are sometimes vendors involved, as we had a number of them on these panels. We've prepped them and asked them as well, don't pitch your feature or don't pitch your product. Talk about the stories and war stories and best practices that you've seen in the field. That applies for consultants and everybody else as well. The legal fine print at the bottom is antitrust fine print that really is about don't do or share things that are confidential or could be used for unfair negotiating with a vendor, like private negotiated prices or things like that. So the FinOps Foundation, for the new folks who are joining, and I think there's actually quite a few on this call, is focused in these three areas. I'd summarize this to say, we're all about the people who do cloud financial management, the people who do FinOps, whatever you want to call it. We're about helping you and your careers and your practices get better. So there's a lot of community we do via the Slack and meetings like this and regional meetups. We've got some training and certification paths that we'll talk about here in a bit. And the big thing we're going to cover a lot in the intro is how we're working at open source standards to make your lives and your jobs easier. Today, we've got about 2,700 practitioners. That is those who are not vendors, not at the clouds, who are doing this practice. That's up from about 1,500 this summer when we announced the integration with the Linux Foundation. So very excited about getting more and more folks plugged in. And the biggest announcement of the month or the year for me is welcoming Stacy Case to our team as the first full-time person at the FinOps Foundation. Welcome, Stacy. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're going to be doing?
Absolutely. Thank you. And hello, everyone. It's good to join this community. I'm so excited about this opportunity and joining this team and building out this community. A little bit about myself. Most recently, I came from AWS, where I was really focused on helping customers build business cases for moving to on-prem to cloud. So working with them to help the very beginning of their migration journey. What is that going to look like? And associating what is that going to cost also, so help them make those decisions moving forward. And while I was there, also really helping build out the training for the product that I was working on and enabling it and making sure our entire organization had access to it and could really speak to it and train on it. Before that, was at Cloudability. So this is very much a full circle moment for me that I'm really excited about. When I was at Cloudability, I was part of the team that put together the very first customer advisory board and organized bringing all the people to Cloudability to present that. And as many of you know, if you've the history of FinOps kind of was born out of that meeting. So this is very much a full circle moment for me. And I'm super excited to come back to this group of people that are so excellent and wonderful to work with. And I've already seen so many people too that I know, so it's wonderful. So while I'm here at FinOps, my goal really is, as Director of Operations and Training, is I'm really focused on helping us scale out our training and education. How can we deliver that FinOps messaging and training to as many people as we can, bring more people into our community so we can start building out better best practices and really enable the different open source outputs that we have available. I'm here to help you. I'm here to help support your needs that you have as a practitioner. I'm a good person to come to ask questions. I might not know them all already because I've only been here for a week and a half, but I'll get there.
Questions could also be about pop culture because she knows everything
Yes,
about it.
I do know a lot about pop culture that has nothing to do with FinOps, but I'm your person if you want to know who that movie was, what that movie was that you saw 3 years ago with that person that had the dog. I probably know that. And JR, yes, I'm here to make FinOps great again. Not that it wasn't ever great, but it's going to be even better. I'm super excited to join the team. My contact information is on there. Please do not hesitate to just say hi or reach out, ask a question, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. So JR, if you want to go to the next slide. So real quick, I just want to talk to you about some of the certification and to become a certified practitioner that we have going on. I'll be working really closely with our practitioners to lead the instructor-led trainings. We have one scheduled on December 1st, they'll be the 1st and the 2nd, and also one that's December 15th and 16th that's friendly to Australian time zone. So if that works for you, I'd highly recommend going out to finops.org/certification to look for those. Also, I'm super excited to announce that we are moments away from pulling the trigger on our first self-paced course. So this is, if you don't have the time to go to an instructor-led training, you can buy our self-paced course. It's going to give you all the same great materials, all the same great knowledge. It's also going to include the redemption code to get your certified practitioner exam so you become certified. Typically, it's going to be $499 until December 15th. We're giving you a great discount at $399, so it's a great way to get your team certified. Considering that we also sell the exam for only $300, so just think of that for $99 more that you're getting all of that education and instructor-led information with it. So please take advantage of that. The link's at the very bottom there if you want to check out all of our training options.
Well, thank you, Stacy. Welcome. So glad to have you here. I'm going to take about 7 or 8 minutes and give an update on what the foundation is working on before we get into the panel. We've left about 45 minutes for the panel discussion and about 15 minutes after that for those who want to stay on to do further discussion. I brought this screenshot in to show that, whenever we've asked the questions about what you want from us as the foundation, it's typically been really focused around education, collaboration, knowledge, standards. It's the how, the why, what do we do in our organizations? And these challenges are things that, particularly in the last few months, as we've seen a big influx of new people at big new enterprises, not the early adopters, right? Not the Spotifys and Atlassians, but the giant Fortune 100s who are doing this. We've heard a lot of questions about just how do we know what the roadmap is for setting up this practice, and how do we know if we're being successful at it, and how do we determine who owns what and benchmark it, and then is there a way for us to map this against an open standard like we can do with our security standards, ISO and SOC, et cetera, and to sort of show our execs that we're doing everything we've needed. So in the early days of the foundation and a lot of the sort of work we did around for the book and whatnot, we focused around sort of guiding principles, such as, teams need to collaborate and, take advantage of the variable nature of cloud, et cetera, that were fed into a basic capabilities architecture of here's basic capabilities you need. And those kind of fit into this circular, inform, optimize, operate life cycle. We're realizing that organizations need a lot more and a lot more granular roadmap and path. So the foundation, working with our Technical Advisory Council, has agreed to move forward with an approach of what we're calling the FinOps framework. And this is meant to be a very prescriptive, specific roadmap in order to build a FinOps practice in the enterprise. So this includes everything you need to be able to do, the capabilities, the personas, the learning paths, KPIs of what they need to be tracking. And the idea being that, a new organization could take this and really set up a new practice, or an existing one could take this and evaluate where they sit. So like everything we're doing, we're taking a very iterative approach on it. This will become the new primary output from an open source standards aspect of the FinOps Foundation. With each various SIG, we have a finance SIG, a special interest group, engineering one, we've got a Kubernetes one, we'll own a portion of this. So we're going to roll the first version of this out at a very, alpha v.1 on December 15th. And then this is going to have sort of a likely quarterly versioned update. And I hate to go all waterfall and version something, but we want companies and vendors and open source, whoever, to be able to look at that and say, yeah, we align to this latest edition of this framework. So I think this will add a lot of clarity to the work we do and give those who want to contribute expertise a great model to do that. So watch for information on that coming out. That is going to be coupled with our first data collection. And this goes out to the first set of early practitioners this week, which is the State of FinOps survey. It's got a few focuses and goals for us. Selfishly, we want to understand better who those 2,700 practitioners are, what they need from us, what we can do better to provide for them. More broadly, though, and less selfishly, we want to provide industry insights, right, for our members to use, for analysts to use, for whoever to use, to understand and talk about this nascent space. And hopefully for you, as you who are practitioners, for example, to get answers to questions about how others are doing FinOps. So we're targeting to do a first sort of preview of some of the early bits of this data in December, but the real focus is in late Jan, early Feb, depending on as speed of responses for quantifiable count of those. We're going to do a larger State of FinOps survey. So when that goes out, we're like, how can we incentivize people? So we're it feels a little hokey, but we're giving a free FinOps t-shirt for anybody who takes it, and then a big discount on that self-paced course. If those aren't valuable to you, fine. We would love to get your inputs. This is about us being able to help serve you better, but watch for those emails as they come out. Also wanted to welcome some of our new vendor members who have joined in the last month or so. These are organizations who are either providing FinOps platforms or FinOps services or FinOps training. Really good collection of companies. Software One is a very large consulting and services company, has got a platform out of Switzerland. Densify is many of you may have heard, a US-based company that's had a FinOps platform for quite some time. Pilius, a great newer vendor out of Israel who's building FinOps tooling. Verticent, which is a solutions provider service team that's doing a bunch of different areas, but is building a solid FinOps practice. Cruise Worker, who some of you may know Oliver Gehrman. He's been involved with the foundation as an individual. He's building AWS Cloud Financial Management trainings. His organization is joining as a member. And then one of the things that I'm most excited about, since we've got such a training focus, is we've got a fantastic new APAC partner based on Australia, Cloud CMX, who is putting out a whole series of courses and trainings there. So opening up our reach a bit. So those companies are all part of the vendor member programs that we announced over the summer, the platform training and service partners, and they are joining the ever-growing list of our initial launch partners with the goal for us, because historically we only had practitioners, but we're trying to get complete alignment between practitioners, all the vendor members, and all the clouds as well, so that the standards and the best practices that we agree, we're all working together on those. So look for this list of companies and clouds to grow as we move forward. Made it with 1 minute to spare in my 15-minute intro, which brings us to the main event. So we built out, as many of you saw, a white paper that was launched earlier this week, and it was really a collaborative effort. If you look at the acknowledgements section of that white paper, there's a bunch of individual names in there. Very much, as we say, practitioners, vendors, clouds, the whole split. I did want to give a very specific thank you and shout out to Chris Anichek from the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, their CTO. He was the guy who had the idea to do this collaboration. We announced this with the CNCF this week, and he's been really helpful pushing that forward. And today, we're going to talk through why and how Kubernetes challenges with cloud financial management are different. Containers and Kubernetes are becoming a major choice for enterprises and tech companies of all sizes all around the world. And in a containerized world, traditional FinOps cost allocation concepts don't always work. Optimization concepts are very different. The way that we're actually rolling out ownership of responsibilities in the enterprise shifts around considerably. So this white paper was really put together to consider key questions, challenges, considerations that any team doing this work already or starting it in a containerized world would need to know in order to really effectively build out that practice. So for today's panel, I'm going to be co-moderating it with Mr. Hyun Park from Amalgam Insights. Hyun, do you mind doing an intro?
Sure, no problem. Hi, I'm Hyun Park. I'm an industry analyst at Amalgam Insights. We're an industry analyst firm that focuses on technology expense management as well as operations management. And I've been an industry analyst for about a dozen years, looking at changes across telecom expense, network expense, enterprise mobility, IoT, SaaS, and of course, cloud cost management, FinOps. And putting together best practices as well as vendor recommendations in each of these areas. So what I do is I feel very aligned to what FinOps Foundation is trying to do. Let's work together and create best practices and shared knowledge so that we can all do a better job of doing this. So it's a pleasure to join you today.
Thank you. It was really good timing. Hyun had put out a analysis on Kubernetes vendor tooling in the space right before we launched this white paper. So when we saw that, reached out to him because he's done a lot of research and insights into this and wanted to broaden the scope here of questions. We also are joined by 5 panelists who contributed to the white paper. Wanted to ask each of you to do a short, meaning like 30-second at most intro so we can spend the meat of the time on the questions. And let's start with Debo Aderabigbe.
Hey everyone, I'm Debo Aderabigbe and I'm a Google Cloud PM, specifically in the billing and monetization space. I spend a lot of time looking at cost data, and that's cost data that includes some of the stuff that goes into things like billing, BigQuery export, attribution of costs to various parts of your billing workloads, and of course, thinking about how contextually sensitive cost containers and things that are related to it, like Kubernetes or Anthos, work when they come to actually analyzing your usage and costs. So super happy to be here and to help give some insights that we've collected from customers and some thoughts about how we help you to manage it from a Google and otherwise perspective in this panel.
Awesome, welcome Debo. And can we just work down this list from there, Webb?
Yeah, thanks JR so much for having me today. I actually used to be in Debo's role, so formerly a Google PM working on infrastructure monitoring, now co-founder and CEO of KubeCost. We started the company 2 years ago, and we were focused on building cost and capacity management solutions, purpose-built for teams running Kubernetes. We work with more than 1,000 teams today running our products that are kind of based in open source and deeply tied into a lot of the CNCF open source projects like Prometheus, Grafana, et cetera.
Welcome. Do we have Jonathan on the line? One out of 6. Hopefully we're only going to be missing one. Jonathan, are you there? Let's go ahead to Casey, and Jonathan can jump in later if he joins.
Great. Thanks, Jared. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Awesome. Having some internet issues earlier. Well, great to see everyone, and thanks to JR, Stacy, the rest of the foundation, et cetera, for kind of pulling this together. So Casey Doran, I lead the product management team for Cloudability within Apptio. I've been working on cloud financial management, for Cloudability specifically for the last 3.5 years. I was the original PM on our Kubernetes cost allocation functionality, and just look forward to talking about this topic and getting feedback from the group.
Welcome. And Jonathan, are you on now? Nope, still can't hear you if you're talking. I think I see you on there, but all right, Mikhail.
Thanks, JR, and thanks for the opportunity. I'm VP of Product Strategy at Densify. Densify being a vendor kind of in this space, public cloud container optimization. But in addition to that, we actually run the software for majority of our customers as SaaS, and that runs in containers. And we run in multiple clouds. So we actually kind of a big user by our standards, by our size, of course, of both AWS. We played in GKE, but and also in IBM Cloud, IKS. So I hope I can kind of bring both perspectives, a lot of information from the customers and kind of war stories there, but also our own.
Excellent. So for those of you who didn't see in the chat, Jonathan is having some mic issues. He is product manager for container at Cloud Health VMware. So hopefully he'll be able to jump in here a bit later. So let's get into the questions. And just to set some framework and ground rules, we have 9 topics we're going to dig into. We have about 45 minutes scheduled for that. So we're going to try and keep total questions to about 3 or 4 minutes each. People on the call, if you have questions, please drop them into the chat for now. We'll have an open discussion at the end. And we're going to ask these questions. Hyun and I will go back and forth. We'll direct it to one of the panelists first, and then other panelists feel free to jump in, and then we'll kind of keep us moving forward as we go here. So let's start with sort of the fundamental core challenge of cost allocation, which is mapping costs in cloud back to teams, projects, or cost centers, and the importance of that. This is a little bit different in a container-based world where you may have lots of different things running on single, resources. And so let's start here with Casey, and maybe Casey, could you speak to a bit of the challenges of cost allocation in the container world and why it's harder to report on in Kubernetes versus just running, say, on EC2?
Yeah, thanks, JR. So, I guess, and I'll try my best to set the stage here at a high level so we can drill into this a little bit. But, the methods we've been using for years to allocate our infrastructure really breaks down, with Kubernetes. Traditionally, right, you apply governance, you then apply tag key value pairs to your resources. That data is going to then flow through in your vendor bill. And you can use that data for cost allocation, right? Relatively straightforward. Obviously, there's a lot of work there to do around making sure people apply those tags and those sorts of things. But if you're able to pull that off, relatively straightforward doing that. It totally breaks down, right, with Kubernetes, because a portion of that same underlying infrastructure now belongs to shared clusters that in all likelihood many teams are using. You have many applications running on, et cetera. So given this reality, essentially what you need to do is allocate costs based on that team or that application's usage of the underlying cluster, which is going to be across multiple nodes, multiple resources, right, within that cluster. And to make that even more difficult, right, that data is not going to show up in your vendor bill for the most part, right? So you've got some extra work that you've got to do there. You're also going to have some shared costs. So idle resources in the cluster, management fees that say, for example, GKE may charge you for running a GKE cluster. Those things have to be shared across. And then to add some additional complexity, for the most part, any team that's using Kubernetes likely has some resources that are not running in the Kubernetes cluster that you also need to allocate to them. So you need to consider how you have a single model that can kind of encompass all of these concepts together to fully allocate all the costs.
Yeah, you touched on something there that is a huge challenge even outside of Kubernetes or FinOps, which is shared costs, right? And this introduces a whole another layer of those. Anyone else on the panel want to add context to that or anything else that Casey missed as part of it?
Yeah, I find it, I'd like to kind of mention a couple more concepts that, fairly unique, that in addition to kind of having to worry about the infrastructure, whether those are kind of directly allocated shared costs, there's concept of quotas, say on namespaces, cluster quotas in OpenShift. It almost creates that second layer, right? And a bit of a temptation to say, oh, that's so simple. Maybe I set up quotas and then just charge people for that. Another kind of interesting thing that we see a lot of is folks kind of having to make a decision on the infrastructure, a little bit in isolation from kind of looking at the needs of an actual workload, because if they standardize on a certain type of node, for example, or instance, and they have a size, well, then they kind of trying to force a ratio of CPU to memory on people and say, no, everything is a 1 core, you get 4 gig with that, and that's how that's how the dice rolls in our world, because that's what the infrastructure is sized. And it's almost like it's more than one layer you have to go to, and the teams, the developers are now somewhat separated by the boundaries of the quota and the ratio within that. And so they don't have as much control over the infrastructure anymore because it's shared and it can be managed by other folks. So the discipline and multi-teams becomes important there.
Yeah, Mikhail, that's a great point. And I'm curious how, given all of these multiple layers of infrastructure, nodes, clusters, the time series challenge, it gets much more complicated than simply managing straightforward services and technology. What strategies do you see are effective? And this is for the entire panel in dealing with these allocations, these changes. How do you actually start making sense out of all of this at the ephemeral level that containers are at?
Well, surprisingly, I'll try first. Like with humans, and of course, it's in human nature to try to simplify. So the first strategies that we see is exactly that, what I mentioned, where folks try to make sense of it in the simpler terms, like, oh, and I can understand quotas. That's very simple. I assign quota to people and I'll just deal with it that way. Let them manage how they're going to divvy it up, right? And then there's, call it the right way, which is more scientific, which is basically, well, try to gather as much empirical data. And it's not unlike, your standard kind of FinOps issue, allocation-based charging versus utilization-based, right? Of course, utilization-based is, it would require more data and a little bit more discipline and harder to do, but it kind of has more potential kind of fairness and the benefits there. But it's not as simple. It's not a simple answer. It's a bit of a journey for a lot of folks to kind of have enough stakeholders at the table there. And I guess as we talk more, I might have more examples around kind of like how you bring financial folks in the picture there, and kind of how that can somewhat further provide so many more degrees of freedom to that equation, right?
Great.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts out there, Debo, Webb?
I might throw some in there. I think one of the things that we found that's particularly interesting from at least a cloud vendor perspective is that a lot of people are trying to compare the costs that they have for their on-prem or infrastructure or something that might be moving to even to a less managed infrastructure from like just straight GCE into Kubernetes. And I think one of the things that's been particularly effective for people who are making those movements is to be able to really scope and confirm what their workloads are really going to be. Right. So whether that workload is going to be taking up an entire namespace or it's really just confined to an application, thinking about the units at which they really want to be able to compare costs in one environment to another. That's definitely one of the first steps. The second is to think about all the infrastructure pieces that are going to go into that cost in those different environments, right? So on-prem, it's a little bit harder it's a little bit easier to nail down all those charges, but when you're thinking about your Kubernetes views, you're thinking more about the infrastructure, the persistent disk, all those elements that way. And then you're thinking about some of those shared resources that we alluded to in the first question, right? So kind of having a strategy for how you want to deal with those shared resources generally and how you think about them even in other environments, and then starting to scope those down, at least it gives you something in particular to look for when you're going to kind of start allocating costs. And then it's just a matter of finding the right tools to help you get there, right? And I know that many of the vendors are working furiously to help give the ability to break down those costs in ways that are meaningful, right? Whether it's cost namespaces or labels or cost centers, but having a strategy first to deal with those and set those up, and then be able to look for those costs really helps, because I think in the future, a lot of people will make different decisions based on that. Like, am I going to buy an AWS cost savings plan, or am I going to buy CUDs or SUDs, or am I going to buy whatever thing that will allow me to save on infrastructure based on what I can tell from like cores of usage, RAM of usage, things like that come from looking at your specific workloads and who owns them. So I think those are things we've heard a lot across customers and things that help at least drive having a strategy that you're going to apply to.
So that's great. And you mentioned like the tooling thing, and this space, Kubernetes particularly, is fascinating because, other cost allocation challenges in cloud, typically people can, they can build their own, or they can use native tools, or they can, use a platform. But this space is a little more complicated because all the data that's needed to do cost allocation for Kubernetes isn't necessarily in a single, say, file from the cloud provider. So that's definitely added a dimension. There's a bigger theme that, we talk about a bit in the white paper, and I'm curious, maybe I can give this one to Jonathan if he's back on. Haven't heard from you yet, but a lot of the work in FinOps world is about balancing needs of disparate teams and orgs, right? So finance teams need to allocate budget, charge back, with engineering teams who need to move quickly, who are focused on the sort of tech aspects. How do we get, the best efficiency out of our applications and services? When the Kubernetes containers world in particular, with balancing these things, how do you see companies, balance that structure when it comes to whether it be their allocation strategy or their optimization strategy between those teams? And what are some of the, maybe as a starting place, that question, what are some of the questions and things you should be considering when trying to balance the needs of those teams?
Thanks, JR. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Sorry about that earlier. Yeah, it's funny, you read my mind though. I was about to jump in, I think, based on what some of the things Debo was saying and all the others, Casey McCall, but focusing on, I think such a big part of FinOps is like, well, just how do I allocate costs and account for everything? But this is all part of like a closed loop, a bigger picture of, well, why do I have an application running in the first place, and balancing the costs that application is generating and the value that application is providing, and how different stakeholders measure all those things. And it's not just to like throw all these like meta questions out there. It's more like, I think part of the answer to that question is just being aware of that. So if we're hyper focused on just allocation or just on optimization, it's like, well, a person who was tasked with saving money, you have to obviously, like this goes without saying, you have to realize the application is there to do something. And developing team is building an application. Well, obviously that's generating costs. And so like, how do you balance kind of just the differences of who, and even what you want to account for. So yes, like generally at the end of the day, you want to account for everything in a good way that works for all the business. What we've often seen is, I think just to the broader point, multiple stakeholders are interested in accounting. The dev team sometimes are the first to set something up where they are allocating to the costs. So they're just aware from the beginning of how their design choices are affecting costs. Cool. But then later have to answer finance questions and go, oh, well, we did things a little bit differently. And then obviously sometimes it's the other way, where the more finance-centric teams are doing all the cost allocating and say, oh, we want things in terms of this. But the dev teams look at things a little bit differently. So just being aware of whatever stakeholders and whatever the different, I think maybe the next point here, a bigger discussion we can have, is what incentives are we providing to which of these stakeholders, in terms of like, what happens to you in your job when you spin up something that maybe you didn't need or that you did need or whatnot.
That's a good add-on. If I could prompt a plus to that question, from the incentive standpoint, one of the challenges of this space always is getting engineering teams to take action. So any tips from anyone on the panel around incentives, in the Kubernetes world or otherwise, that you can offer in that model that Jonathan said, to get that action taken and optimization work done?
Well, one thing that I've noticed just from my research is just that every department has its own very detailed taxonomy of things that they care about. Obviously, from an IT perspective, we care a lot about which apps, which workloads, which tasks, which monitoring tools take place. When you talk on the finance side, they never care about any of that. They're always just trying to ask you, how much are you going to cut the freaking cost as a starting point, without really understanding why all of these costs are in place, why we're even using Kubernetes, why we need something serverless. They're simply looking for cost center, budget, forecasting, and then being able to balance these needs, as well as other stakeholders coming into place, whether it be legal, security, etc. There has to be some common ground of language used to be able to, that everybody can understand. Sometimes that means, frankly, dumbing it down. Sometimes it means being able to explain from a business perspective why this is being done, so that everybody can start being on the same page.
Absolutely. So that's probably, again, a good lead into the next question there, which we had around.
Yeah. So, and so one thing I'd toss back is, so once we start digging in, obviously there's an optimization challenge, a waste challenge associated with technical debt that just shows up over time or duplication. You know, what's a good way to be able to figure out what is, how all of that is happening from a Kubernetes perspective? How do you start finding all of that?
Everybody, my name is Jacob.
Yeah, I'm happy to weigh in here. I think it's a critically important question for, and kind of two reasons. I'll kind of touch on the waste part as well as kind of the like shared resource part, but a critical important for really developing a sense of fairness and ultimately buy-in when, you know, like implementing an actual showback or chargeback program. And specifically buy-in with engineering groups in the sense that they feel that costs are distributed or allocated, you know, in a fair manner. And so what we actually see in practice drive kind of the decision here is really what you were just talking about, which is kind of the ownership and relationship of different stakeholders involved. And in this case, when it comes to waste, like specifically on the engineering side, who is kind of owning and controlling some of these like infrastructure provisioning decisions? And if it's, you know, more of a centralized infrastructure team, you know, making all those decisions where individual application engineering teams have little to no influence, it probably makes sense for them to kind of own or manage or be responsible for the kind of waste, like overall waste or idle cost. Whereas if infrastructure teams are giving more application engineering teams more leeway so they can run at higher velocity, spin up their own clusters, spin up their own, you know, namespaces and configure auto scaling, et cetera, it may be more appropriate to kind of assign more of those, you know, idle or slack cost to those individual engineering teams. And then again, I think equally important for just developing a sense of fairness with distributing shared cost really kind of comes down to, you know, the usage of those shared resources as well as kind of the tools at your disposal. We've seen this done successfully in kind of three different capacities. One, just distributing costs uniformly for, say, something like kube system resources that are kind of shared across all tenants, or distribute costs more proportionate to usage. So say general observability tools that are kind of used by all tenants on the platform, or actually saw, you know, reference to, I think like Splunk or something in the chat earlier, which you may want to do a more kind of custom metric driven allocation approach where you're, you know, splitting up shared costs on the basis of like IO or, you know, like a number of transactions completed, something like that.
One
Great
additional
point.
thing I would, sorry, one additional thing I would add in there, and this kind of goes to Webb's point around fairness and having a shared understanding or agreement on how you're doing this. You know, we've been talking a little bit about utilization of the underlying cluster, but you also have to consider, you know, with Kubernetes, you may actually be requesting a certain amount of resources, right, for your workload that you're not actually using, right, but nobody else in the cluster could use it. So you have to have a discussion with those teams around, are we going to use the, you know, the usage data, the request data? Do we consider, okay, if your requests are higher than the usage, is that what we use? And just being transparent about that, so folks can then, you know, they know that if you're using requests, okay, let's make sure that we're optimized, you know, from that perspective. So I just want to throw that one in there too.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Is that like that constant balance of say, you know, reserved capacity, request capacity with, you know, what's being utilized is and quite often kind of just seeing a big gap between the utilization and the consumption of infrastructure, and then realizing that that gap is indeed potentially quite a lot due to over reservation going on. And it boils down to, okay, well, whose problem is it, right? Because of the different personas in this environment. You know, there's obviously engineering teams, there's who are kind of using it, or the application owners, and then, you know, you got your FinOps people and the executives putting the pressure on. But there's a lot of the teams, and it's the shared infrastructure we've kind of one, I guess, good thing with the container platform, having a lot of complexity. Quite often we see organizations having, teams taking ownership of the platform itself, with all the associated software and the tooling, right? And those folks are usually, incentivized to say, well, it's also your goal to keep the utilization high. And now they kind of become, men in the middle, trying to talk to potentially dozens of different app teams with their conflicting priorities, with a lot of pressure to basically keep stuff running, and the objectives that are measured in transactional type things, and then campaigns, and kind of typically knowing that they would need the capacity one time in the year, and that's what they base all their reservations on, right? So it kind of becomes an interesting game of kind of show back, shame back, because sometimes the chargeback is not even implemented, right? And they have to like try to just get them all together and just decide who is the worst offender. Try to go after those folks first.
Mikhail, you mentioned earlier this concept of gaps, and it actually got me thinking about gaps in forecasting and what we project versus where we end up, and then of course how that plays out in the financial world, getting to that chargeback shameback model. I wonder if we might pivot the conversation slightly to talk about forecasting of both usage and cost in the container world, and how to do that to align against budgets for the larger organization. And I haven't heard much from Webb, so if I can pass that one to you, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, happy to touch on this. I would first say that I think JR and Mike's Cloud FinOps book touches on this amazingly well. I'll try to kind of touch on, I think, three things that wasn't a low ball for you to say that, but yes, he did not pay me to say that. But I think they have some like great insights there. I think one thing that does change there is, and it's also part of the complexity we're looking to manage, is you now have much more granular data typically, right? So you can go down and project forward usage on an individual container basis or microservice basis. And so one insight that we've seen is that while using ML models can be super valuable for projecting those, we actually think that you can get further with like simple heuristics because you have more granular metrics, because you can project out for individual containers, individual microservices, namespaces, et cetera. And with that, we think it's really important that you really think deeply about like the application lifecycle or the amount of data that you want to measure over, right? So if you had a big inflection point in the architecture of a microservice, a month ago, you may not want to look at 6 months of data for projecting forward. I think a point that JR makes really well in his book is that like the gold standard we still feel here is that you are kind of normalizing your projections based on kind of business metrics that are relevant to your situation. And that could be number of users, number of API requests, or maybe even number of developers, really just thinking about how your costs will likely scale as the underlying business changes. And then I think it's just really important here to be constantly looking at your actual spend compared to your forecast, and constantly like refining this and understanding, where, if anywhere, you're deviating from plan. And again, I think with Kubernetes, you now have this amazing ability to really drill in and say that, okay, we were off by X% for our production environment. Let's see what namespace, what controller, even what individual pod was driving the cost difference, for example.
Terrific. Just on that note, I'm curious, as we start thinking about how to dig into those costs, what kind of course, many of you have actual tools that you use, but thinking kind of one step back from your tool, how did you think about optimizing Kubernetes costs? How do you align those Kubernetes containers from a time basis, from a use basis, from a resource basis, and make sure that you are making changes efficiently from a cost and operational perspective?
So I can jump in. I noticed kind of a theme with all of our answers so far is that we're talking about all the organizational impacts and all the stakeholders and everything. It would, if all that were aside, I feel like it would seem pretty straightforward. It's like, okay, let's kind of think about it like a Russian doll. So like my containers, like the inside of the Russian doll, the pods after that, let's make sure our pods and services are running very efficiently. So if my service is a point of sale service from my billing app, it's only asking for what it needs. Let me make sure it is doing that. Okay, it's only asking for what it needs. Cool. Now it's like next Russian doll. How are those services orchestrated, and like what kind of node size is going to be good to kind of bin pack those containers like in a good way? Okay, cool. And then how would my node auto scaling kind of working? Kind of like the orchestration infrastructure level outside of the container. And then to me, it's like the third one is, okay, if after all that's optimized and then I'm done, it obviously doesn't quite work that way. Now what RIs, CUDs, savings plans, whatever, can I optimize just at the billing layer, which is almost like the outermost Russian doll. But I think the reason why it's more complicated than that is because we're all trying to do all those things all the time. And so, man, if anybody has like good tips on how to integrate those, I think that's what we're all trying to strive for.
I totally agree. That's what we see all the time as well. There's like an implied flow where say, yep, if you start with the workloads and you optimize them all, it's going to get great, and then you can kind of move on, truly understand what the infrastructure needs, optimize that, and then you buy. Only to try to get even all the app owners to the table together is not a simple thing. You could get a few, others have completely different priorities, so you kind of have to go at it all at the same time. And it's just important to not make a mistake of freezing something. I'll give you an example where we saw where, say it started with finance. They went in and, they have experience with cloud. They know they got to buy those RIs. You buy the coupons, it's you're paying 60%. So they went ahead and they looked at what's being used. They were scientific about it. And then they said, okay, looks like it's an M4. 4x large. Okay, they went ahead and they bought the regular RIs for the 12 months. Well, what that means, of course, is now the infrastructure is locked in, and at the same time, now if they want to use the Rs or if they want to go to Gen 5, no such luck. They were not convertible RIs. They didn't think about saving plans. If they did those, okay, maybe they would have maintained flexibility. Now they just kind of have to wait for the RIs to expire. And there's so many strategies, obviously, to kind of managing this, maybe in more in a roll-in fashion. Don't just buy everything up at once. Kind of like try to do it periodically. So I think maintaining flexibility, but definitely trying to hack at it at all angles. Because do not wait for the workloads to become perfect. That's just never going to happen.
Yeah,
it's a journey. It's not a project-driven stuff.
One just quick thing I'd love to add in, and this is perhaps obvious, but make sure your teams are utilizing the tools that Kubernetes makes available, right? And there are some, whether that's the horizontal pod autoscaler, vertical autoscaler, or cluster autoscaler, those are things that you should be using, because the whole premise there, right, is these things can optimize themselves as we go, and they're not going to be perfect. But if you're not using those things, you're not sort of, using the primary purpose or one of the purposes of Kubernetes in the first place. So you got to make sure that your teams are actually using those and assessing their value to your org.
So we'd love to, pardon the expression, double click on what you just said, which is the tools that Kubernetes makes available, and wonder if we can pass this one to Debo as the cloud provider who's kind of across the data and whatnot. I think there's a perennial question in FinOps of like when to use native tools, when to go to platform, when to build your own, et cetera. I think that's even more confusing in a Kubernetes world. Can you give a basic sort of framework for, if you're here, use Google's tool to do this. If you're here, build something. If you're here, look for a platform. How people should start to think about that, because tooling is a little more complex in the Kubernetes world.
Yeah, there's a bunch of things I'd love to say. I mean, to be honest, one of the things we're really doubling down on is building native cost tools that exist in your billing and data plane, right? So that's one of the places that I have governance over as a PM. And one of the things we're trying to focus on is give you the basic tools and infrastructure to be able to look at your costs in your billing data, right? So that's the ability to say, okay, my application workload is going to be defined by a combination of, let's say, Kubernetes labels, a namespace, a cluster, something like that, so that you can actually take a look at your infrastructure and all the pieces that are contributing to it and say, hey, look, all these things come together to make my workload, and I can actually ascertain the cost of those things all together all at once. We don't have that feature fully developed yet, but we are working on it. And in the meantime, we've actually made available a number of different tools to help you do that. One of those things is the GKE usage metering tool, right? So that's a combination of BigQuery billing export and also the GKE usage metering data that comes together in the export. So you can have a Data Studio template on top of it and be able to filter down what you currently have, right? Those types of things are basic tools to look at the costs and in some cases the resource utilization, so that you can get a basic sense of what's going on. I think one of the things that's typically good in terms of the integrators that work along with us, like the Cloud House, the Aptio/Cloud Abilities of the world, is that they're looking at it from a general, more FinOps-like perspective, right? Giving the views that might break down these things across environments so that you can parallelize if you're a multi-cloud user, or if you're looking to have a perspective that takes advantage of the different types of VMs that you're using and helps you have some recommendations and optimizations that are going with that. As Webb and Casey and others have mentioned, and Mikhail have mentioned, there's a lot of things you're trying to do at the same time, right? And so, when you're looking at the basic perspectives and you have different users that are approaching the console in Google, for example, differently, you might have to have certain combinations of those things that are easier to get from an integrator at like a more advanced level versus some of the basic tools that we're building, right? And this is a rapidly evolving space. So, hopefully we'll have announcements to give to all of you in the next coming set of months and hopefully weeks. But
this is the FriendDA announcement. Nothing's really coming, but there might be something.
No, there's things coming. I just can't give actual dates because I've got my hands tied by the masters. But I think the one thing that I want to make sure that I have delivered as a message is that we're always going to try to provide you the tools to at least manage the costs that we know you're dealing with on our platform, to the level that you might want to have more specific dashboards and things like that help you deal with those costs. You'll want to go with some of those tools.
All right, awesome. Thank you, Debo. We have 7 minutes left in the official time, and then we have 15 minutes over to do the Q&A. We've been recording questions that you all have been doing. So wanted to end the 7 minutes. Yoon, I want to turn you into a panelist to answer this too. I don't know if you're prepared for this. I mean, we'll put you last, but we're going to go down this list starting with Debo, and then we'll circle back to you. 30 seconds or less, each of you. What do you think is the biggest 2021 trend, future-looking trend in FinOps or cloud financial management in general that enterprises need to start to get ahead of? Starting with Debo.
Gosh, I think one of the biggest trends, getting a really good insight on forecasting, I think is going to be pretty huge. There's a lot of things that people have mentioned at a micro level that you're thinking about. If you're able to forecast in any way, something that takes utilization and resource requesting into account across all the resource types that you may be using, especially those that are taking advantage of auto scaling and other things like that, you'll start to look like a genius to your organization if you're within any striking distance of being right? And that's valuable in terms of costs. So I think people are going to probably start moving that direction pretty significantly.
Awesome. What do you think, Webb?
I think, this transition to containerized workloads is still just at the beginning of its maturity level. I still think we have a lot of change to come here. So I think if you look at the inform, optimize, operate lifecycle of FinOps, I still think it's nailing the inform part and specifically around nailing allocation in a containerized world. That I think is so fundamental for teams to get ahead of, and that I think so many positive things fall out of that when you have an agreed upon allocation model. Things like chargeback, budgets, forecasting, I think all of it becomes easier to get all stakeholders bought in when you've nailed that allocation.
Yeah, everybody wants to jump to optimize, but it's that inform allocate stage that's so critical. Great. Jonathan, 2021 trend.
I'm going to actually go with just actually a lot of what we talked about here, just the cost allocation problem, but in a more general sense. So not just containers, but hey, we all share a data lake. How do we split that cost when we all share that service? So on and so forth. So as our apps kind of become disparate services and some resources are like really large, significant shared resources, some are more like little tiny chunks of code that run a serverless thing, and it all becomes a lot more ephemeral and hard to grasp. How do we split and share more costs? I'll go with that one.
Yep, splitting and sharing, that's definitely a big one. Casey?
Yeah, I'm gonna go a little bit more high level. You know, I think we've done an incredible job on, you know, the folks in this group, the FinOps Foundation, et cetera, on, you know, developing best practices around, you know, inform, optimize, operate, et cetera, largely focused though on the raw materials, you know, of cloud, right? The actual infrastructure. But I think the teams are going to want to start thinking more about, you know, the SaaS products that they use, Atlassian, Datadog, et cetera, and bringing those into that model. The labor that works on cloud, the cost of some migration project that they might be running, those sorts of things. All of those things, activities can benefit, you know, from the same kind of inform, optimize, operate model that FinOps has developed. So really interesting to me, you know, as we start to hear folks wanting to bring those additional, you know, arguably cloud costs into that model and how that moves forward.
Right, so getting that total cost of ownership, total view with SaaS and labor and everything makes sense. Mikhail?
What I believe for 2021, what we kind of see with some of our large enterprise customers is folks are kind of very much done playing with the containers at a smaller scale. And this year, what we're seeing is things are getting more kind of standardized and generalized. A lot of folks are coming up with a suite of like a full-grown stack, the container management platform in a bigger sense, kind of on top of Kubernetes, of course, but it includes a whole suite of open source and other kind of homegrown tools, and they trying to mandate that the folks are starting to use it. And what we also seen is that the obviously the cost aspect for both the kind of the chargeback, showback, but just the optimization in general, is starting to play at scale in this case, and where folks are now starting to really look at that white space of underfilled, underutilized kind of containers, whether they can just, you know, cost avoidance, try to leverage what they have on-prem, you know, instead of going to the cloud where they know it's going to cost them, or find some kind of other economies of scale, including, of course, it's a shared infrastructure. So more sharing and more optimization baked in, and essentially we can see them actively bringing in or developing their own kind of tooling around cost aspect of things as part of that stack, and that's pretty exciting.
Awesome. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, you touched on something that Casey did a bit too, right? Which is that like bringing on-prem other areas into that. And, you know, we hear a lot of conversations about licensing for on-prem and how that carries over and how to marry those things up. So yeah, I think those are definitely all great ones. And we're just at the end of the time. So Ian, do you want to, well, into the first hour, we have 15 minutes after this for those who want to stay. Do you want to give us your 2021 and then take us into the Q&A based on the questions folks added? I put them all in our doc.
So I totally agree with other panelists talking about the big picture, understanding SaaS, network, data, how all of that aligns to the bigger cloud picture. I'm also really hoping that 2021 is a time when we can work on better tagging taxonomies, standardization, and coming to some sort of shared understanding of how we can better tag and then use those tags financially and operationally to align to processes and resources and financial information in greater detail. Great. So with that, we've got a lot of questions in the chat. Let's see, I'm going to go last in, first out to start with. So I see a question from Michael Klug about, is there room for the conversation? Okay, this ties in a little bit to what we were just talking about. Is there room to expand beyond cloud service provider costs? Operations can include software licensing, facilities, office rent costs. The interaction between finance and different organizational interpretations of operations needs to account for a huge number of costs. So I'm really interested in hearing about this from the panel. Many of you, of course, are managing cloud costs, cloud resources, but how are you thinking about labor, software, the other things that, frankly, the solutions that have been built aren't necessarily built to look at? How do you start bringing the rest of that in?
I mean, my point of view is you start looking at the associations, right? And some of that can be gleaned through the data. So if you have an agile project running, where you're developing a certain, set of software, that team is using underlying infrastructure that you can use all the things that we've talked about to allocate, but very clearly then the labor associated with that project aligns, specifically in the same way as that infrastructure. And then that team very well also may have licensed users of Atlassian products or other products. And so using data, to bring those things together, align the way that you tag these resources, maybe though in a case of a SaaS product, it might be you're tagging, humans to say these humans belong, to this cost allocation group, et cetera. So I think it's, to me, applying these same concepts to those other costs. And in a lot of ways you can do that, through the data that's provided, whether that's in the, the billing, file from the vendor. It's just a different sort of angle to look at it. But the most important thing, this goes to your point around tagging, is having a unified way of thinking about this across those different cost categories, and still applying those same, tags or labels, et cetera. So then you can start to distribute.
I'll try to answer from a different angle too, is more kind of, it's important to be transparent about it too, making sure you're not kind of just charging people for everything, so to speak, or try to come up with a Cadillac service that, includes DR for everybody, things like that. Like, make sure, it's clearly stated, that the service includes this or that and additional extra software. And when people don't want it, they can get routed somewhere else where, they get the appropriate functionality for what they need, and they don't kind of overbuy, because that's the same problem with the public cloud too. It's kind of, why don't I get the Xeon based one? That seems to be the fastest.
It's a theme I've heard so much in the last year of don't boil the ocean with your FinOps processes or cloud management, whatever you're going to call it. I mean, allocation in particular, you could spend years perfecting it with all the shared costs, but you've got to move quickly enough and get good enough in place. There was a cultural question that came in the middle there. It might have been from Jez, I forget who it was, but when coaching developers in the early stages of your FinOps practice, set up an organization, what are the 3 things, or maybe each of you throw out a KPI, that you want them focused on, and how to incentivize against that? So what do we think developers should be watching in the early stages setting up their practice?
I think, to your point, starting, with what you can, starting with something, keep it simple, waste. So I think just that key, like, well, first of all, let's just remove stuff that's waste. Let's put stuff off the table. Like, as folks kind of mature in this space, you do have conversations around, well, what if we kind of design this differently? This is very expensive. This is a very expensive way to build this feature or this product or deliver this business value. Let's actually use a different cloud service. Let's code it differently. But that's like kind of getting up the maturity stack. I still think the steps before that are like just waste. If you're not using it, like, how do I find stuff you're not using or you didn't need, and just not do it?
Yeah, I totally agree with Jonathan there, is looking at, waste or cost efficiency as like, a first kind of golden signal is being really valuable. I think one thing that's super valuable to think about next is just like trends, overall trends, right? So like, trends in waste, and then also just trends in overall spend, whether that's at the cluster level, namespace level, et cetera. I think a lot of things quickly emerge once you have time series data. and you're able to like intuit, the direction like each of these variables are moving.
Great. One of the questions that I saw in the chat several times was simply, what metrics should we really be looking at as we think about specifically Kubernetes cost management, other than obviously the cost? Where do we start looking after that?
This is where FinOps plugs the KPIs, part of their what is it, GitHub page, right? I think there's a good conversation there. Sorry.
Yeah, we'll put all this framework. Well, and so just to see that a little bit, because I only have about this much knowledge of Kubernetes aspect in this. I mean, I hear terms like quotas that Mikhail mentioned. Or, there's a concept of like resource reservations. Like there's, I'm going to say it wrong, but some concept of waste or unused, resources within the cluster or pod, like what in that realm of
Whitepaper does a good job, I think, of kind of explaining a few concepts like requests and limit and quota, and also talking about the utilization versus allocation kind of based models. Depending on what you adopt is the data that you get. The allocation based stuff a little bit easier. You just have to look at the resources section of in your manifests, and you'll see the requests and limits for CPU and memory. That's pretty much right there. The request there is a reservation. There is a guarantee. The limit is a cap, right? Then obviously, if you want to go to utilization, there are corresponding metrics. CPU utilization in cores or in millicores, right? Things are usually measured in millicores, and you have to be careful, to use the little m, because sometimes people put the big one, and that's a million of cores. We've seen that happen actually, kind of anecdotally, and then memory. There's a couple memory metrics you could use. Prometheus is an excellent tool, and it's been, since last few releases, extremely stable, a resource, not a resource pig. So we see that used a lot by folks. And you slap something like a Grafana on top of it, you can visualize your metrics. And then of course there's a number of tools that go way beyond that.
Another thing that we talk about a bit in the white paper is just the idea of applying utilization to cost. So if you imagine your cluster is an overall bucket of cost, and you've got utilization in the cluster. But if you take AWS, for example, they don't bill you for memory. They don't bill you for CPU. They bill you, for an instance. And so you have to come up with a model for how much do I care about memory? How much do I care about CPU? It might be slightly easier the way Google bills, for example, but then you have to have a different model for Google than you have for AWS if you happen to be using things in both platforms. So super critical that you think about those metrics also in terms of how you're actually building.
Awesome. So there was a question in here as well that I pulled out, which was about how would you recommend teams structure themselves to proactively plan, budget, assess, estimates versus cost impacts. Is this ad hoc monitoring? Are they building certain systems for the teams, and where does that sit?
I guess one thing that I would just throw out before you start thinking about organizing your teams that way is whether or not you have to think about the models that you're going to use to do some accounting for these teams in general, right? So, chargeback, showback, for example, where they're going to actually allow the team to be distributed and have, federated budgets and things like that. That might be a question that you want to tackle first. Then when you start going into thinking about how you're going to actually have that, you might want to have at least a general idea of how the applications that you're going to use are going to share, cluster charges or actually have shared resources. We have some folks who, as customers, do all their cluster management in a single project in GKE, for example. And then they use labels and a lot of those strategies to say, okay, now we're going to identify the resources that the teams are going to account and budget for. And we give a budget that we, manage centrally to make sure that we deal with those costs, versus the other way where you might say we have a budget that the teams can use to get the infrastructure and stuff that they need, but they got to label their stuff so that we can all have it flow through to the main bill and then isolate the portions that they're responsible for. So I would say that definitely organize the teams. That's the best way for you to build the application or whatever you need. But then just keep in mind your strategy for actually breaking down those costs as well. That's just at least a bit of advice. But I'm sure the others in the panel might have different views on what you might do once you get past that point.
Yeah, I think a good starting point is just not to reinvent the wheel. You've got an accountant on your team or somebody in your controller team who is assigned to your department. You've got probably got a project management or a project or portfolio management team in place already, keeping track of the portfolio of things that are taking place. And they all have their tags, their cost centers, their profit centers, all their definitions that are already in place. And so you want your project person, you want your finance person, you might want somebody from legal or security, depending on what you're doing from a governance perspective. And then that way you just kind of have these roles crossed off without having to reinvent everything from scratch and then take an engineering view and then find out, oh, although I did this correctly from an engineering perspective, this doesn't actually align to what our company does, unfortunately.
I was going to say something similar and also point back to what Webb actually said, which is just monitoring trends and just having an eye on trends, getting comfortable and familiar with the trends. And for folks who are very new to it, having an eye on the cycles. So whether it's a daily cycle or a weekly cycle, you may find patterns there that you might not have expected, and certainly the monthly cycle, the billing cycle. To see, certain cloud environments have some monthly billing corrections and stuff, and you don't really see all that. That gets a little bit away from the app trends and your app forecasting and more kind of financial constructs, but sometimes they're more related than you think.
I think that's a good general FinOps or iterative best practice, right? Is looking at the cycles, trying to shorten them over time, right? So they're faster, and then ultimately driving them with metrics, right? So there's not people involved, and that's sort of the muscle with all this stuff. It's getting good enough so the organization can do that. Definitely. So I think we have time for one more question. Anybody on the panel want to highlight one that you really want to answer? Or?
Oh, fun one I say is wonder if you've seen customers even venture to leveraging Monte Carlo simulation. I'm going to stretch that out a little bit and say anybody doing some sort of advanced analytics associated with their Kubernetes cost management or going beyond simple dashboards and trend lines.
Fantastic. Well, big thank you to all the panelists and all the contributors to the white paper. There's a long list, and to all of you who joined and stayed on. We got 150 people who stayed more than an hour. That's really cool. We have all the resources available for the white paper on the website and the Slack. I'm gonna throw you into the bus, Stacy. If you ever need anything, email Stacy@finops.org for right now. If you get stuck, she can help you triage.
I'm going to tell you that you didn't even need to throw me under the bus because it's already happening after the beginning of this conversation. I've got a lot of messages coming in.
Awesome. And yeah, two things to highlight. Look for that framework if you want to contribute to that. Again, you can ping Stacy to understand how that's all going through our technical advisory council. And please watch for the survey that's coming out. We are going to be hounding you all, particularly the practitioners, to answer that so we can get some good industry data. And yeah, again, thank you to everybody who joined and all your contributions. Exciting to see this brain trust.
Awesome.
With that,
thanks, everyone.
Have a good one.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Good to see you.
Cheers, everybody.